The morning sun cast long shadows across the city as Detective Frank Reynolds pulled his sedan into the parking lot of the Daily Grind, a small coffee shop just 3 blocks from the police station. He hadn't slept properly in days. The night shift was taking its toll, and the circles under his eyes had darkened to the point where his teenage daughter had jokingly offered him her concealer that morning. "Just one decent cup of coffee," he muttered to himself as he locked his car. The department's coffee was nothing short of awful, like drinking hot, bitter water that somehow left a burnt aftertaste. Reynolds had been working homicide for 15 years, and in that time, the only thing that hadn't improved was the quality of the break room coffee. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The Daily Grind was packed, as it always was at this hour. The smell of freshly ground beans and warm pastries filled the air, a welcome contrast to the stale donut smell that seemed permanently embedded in the precinct walls. Reynolds scanned the room, his police instincts automatically cataloging faces and exits. His shoulders slumped when he realized there wasn't a single empty table. That's when he spotted it, an empty chair at a table near the window. A well-dressed black man sat alone reading something on his tablet while occasionally sipping from a large mug. Reynolds hadn't seen him around before, but that wasn't unusual. The coffee shop sat at the intersection of the financial district and government offices, drawing in all types. Reynolds had been on his feet for nearly 12 hours straight. The triple homicide case was going nowhere. His lieutenant was breathing down his neck for results, and now all he wanted was to sit down with a decent cup of coffee before heading home. He made his way to the counter, ordered the largest black coffee they offered, and then headed straight for that empty chair. Without so much as a nod to the table's occupant, Reynolds pulled out the chair and dropped into it with a heavy sigh. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor, causing several nearby patrons to glance over. The man looked up from his tablet, surprise registering on his face. He was in his early 40s with closely cropped hair just beginning to show, strands of gray at the temples. His suit was expertly tailored, the kind Reynolds could never afford on a detective's salary. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice measured and calm. "I'm actually saving that seat for someone." Reynolds had already taken his first sip of coffee, feeling the blessed caffeine beginning to work its magic. He lowered the cup slowly, eyeing the man across from him. Something about the way the day had gone, the witness who'd recanted her statement, the evidence that had led to a dead end, the phone call from his ex-wife about late child support, it all culminated in this moment. "Look around, buddy," Reynolds said, gesturing to the packed cafe. "There's nowhere else to sit. I've been on my feet all night. I'll move when your friend shows up." The man straightened slightly. "My colleague will be here any minute. There are some seats opening up at the counter. I'd appreciate if you'd—" "I said I'll move when they get here." Reynolds cut him off, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from the next table. He didn't normally behave this way. Reynolds prided himself on being one of the good ones, a cop who treated everyone with respect regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. But something about today, about this man with his perfect suit and calm demeanor, rubbed him the wrong way. The man studied Reynolds for a moment, then glanced down at the detective's belt where his badge was clipped. A flash of recognition crossed his face. "You're with the department," he said, not a question but a statement. Reynolds felt a spike of defensive pride. "That's right. Detective Frank Reynolds, homicide." He didn't offer his hand. "I see." The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge and ID card. Anthony Wilson, Director of Internal Affairs. The coffee Reynolds had just swallowed suddenly felt like acid in his stomach. Of all the tables in all the coffee shops in the city, he had to pick the one with the new head of IA. Reynolds had heard rumors about Wilson's appointment a few weeks back, the department's first black director of internal affairs. There had been the usual grumbling from some of the old guard, but Reynolds had paid little attention. IA wasn't something he worried about. He did his job by the book. But now, sitting across from Wilson after being rude and dismissive, Reynolds felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," Reynolds said, already pushing back his chair. "I didn't realize—" "No need to move on my account, Detective," Wilson said, closing his ID wallet and returning it to his pocket. Though I would appreciate basic courtesy, regardless of who I am. The words stung because they were true. Reynolds knew he would have behaved differently if Wilson had been an older white man in a suit. The realization made his face burn with shame. "You're right," Reynolds admitted, running a hand across his stubbled jaw. "I've had a rough night, but that's no excuse. I apologize." Wilson nodded, accepting the apology with a simple, "Thank you, detective." An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Reynolds contemplated leaving, but something made him stay. Maybe it was the need to salvage his first impression with the new IA director, or maybe it was simple human decency, finally breaking through his exhaustion. "The triple homicide on Westlake," Wilson said suddenly, looking up from his tablet. "That's your case, isn't it?" Reynolds blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. How did you—" "I make it my business to know what's happening in the department, especially the high-profile cases," Wilson explained. "Any leads?" Reynolds hesitated. Discussing an open investigation wasn't standard protocol, but this was the Director of Internal Affairs. "Nothing solid. The witness who claimed to see the shooter changed her story this morning. Says she didn't see anything now." Wilson frowned slightly. "Intimidated?" "Possibly," Reynolds admitted. "Or maybe she just didn't see what she thought she saw. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable." "But you don't believe that's the case here," Wilson said, again making a statement rather than asking a question. Reynolds found himself surprised by Wilson's perceptiveness. "No, sir, I don't. She was too specific in her initial statement. Described the shooter's limp, the logo on his jacket. Those aren't details you make up." A woman in a business suit approached their table, coffee in hand. "Sorry, I'm late, Anthony. The budget meeting ran long." She noticed Reynolds and paused. "No problem, Lisa," Wilson said. "Detective Reynolds was just keeping me company." He turned to Reynolds. "Detective, this is Lisa Chen, Deputy Mayor's office." Reynolds stood quickly, nearly knocking over his coffee. "Ma'am," he nodded. "I was just leaving." Chen smiled politely and took the seat Reynolds had vacated. As he turned to leave, Wilson called after him. "Detective, good luck with your case, and maybe get some sleep. You look like you need it." Reynolds nodded, oddly touched by the concern in Wilson's voice. "Thank you, sir, I will." As he stepped back into the morning sunlight, Reynolds felt a strange mix of emotions. Embarrassment over his behavior, certainly, but also a grudging respect for Wilson, who had handled the situation with dignity. Reynolds had encountered his share of bureaucrats and politicians in his years on the force, and most would have either ignored his rudeness or made a point of putting him in his place. Wilson had done neither. He'd simply treated Reynolds like a human being who'd made a mistake. Reynolds glanced at his watch and sighed. He should head home, get some sleep before tonight's shift. But as he walked to his car, his mind kept returning to the witness who'd changed her story. Something wasn't right there, and his conversation with Wilson had somehow cleared his exhaustion-fogged brain enough to see it. Instead of turning toward home, Reynolds found himself driving back to the precinct. The witness had been scared of something, or someone, and Reynolds was going to figure out what or who that was. He owed it to the victims, and somehow he felt like he owed it to Wilson too, to be the kind of detective who didn't let things slide, who didn't take the easy way out. As he pulled into the precinct parking lot, Reynolds had no way of knowing that his path would cross with Anthony Wilson's again very soon, under circumstances neither of them could have imagined, and that the next time, there would be far more at stake than an uncomfortable conversation over coffee. 3 days after the coffee shop encounter, Detective Frank Reynolds found himself back at the daily grind. His investigation into the triple homicide had finally yielded results. The witness hadn't changed her story out of confusion. She'd been threatened. Reynolds had spent 48 hours tracking down evidence of the threat, and now he had enough to make an arrest. He felt he deserved a decent cup of coffee to celebrate. The IK morning crowd had thinned out by the time he arrived. Reynolds ordered his usual and scanned the room, half expecting to see Anthony Wilson at the same table by the window. The table was empty. Reynolds felt an odd mix of relief and disappointment. He chose a table in the corner and sipped his coffee slowly, savoring both the rich flavor and the satisfaction of good police work. His phone buzzed with a text from his partner. The arrest warrant had come through. They were good to go. Reynolds drained his cup and stood to leave when the bell above the door jingled. Anthony Wilson walked in talking on his phone. He was dressed more casually today, slacks and a button-down shirt with no tie. Reynolds hesitated, then raised a hand in greeting. Wilson nodded in acknowledgement and continued his call. As Reynolds headed for the door, he overheard Wilson's conversation. "I understand the concerns, Chief, but these incidents need to be addressed. Officer Garcia's use of force was excessive by any standard." Wilson paused, listening. "With all due respect, sir, that's exactly the kind of thinking that damages public trust in the department." Reynolds slowed his pace, his curiosity piqued. Officer Miguel Garcia was well known in the department, a 20-year veteran with a history of complaints about rough handling of suspects, particularly in the predominantly black neighborhoods he patrolled. "I've reviewed the body cam footage myself," Wilson continued, his voice low but firm. "There was no resistance that justified that level of force. We need to take disciplinary action." Reynolds pushed open the door and stepped outside, Wilson's words echoing in his mind. The new IA director was clearly making waves already. Some officers would respect that. Others would see it as a betrayal. Reynolds wasn't sure where he stood. His phone buzzed again. His partner was waiting in the car around the corner. The arrest would have to take priority over his thoughts about departmental politics. 2 weeks later, Reynolds was finishing paperwork at his desk when a commotion near the break room caught his attention. He looked up to see a small crowd of officers gathered around Officer Garcia, who was red-faced and gesturing angrily. "That uppity son of a bitch thinks he can come in here and tell me how to do my job?" Garcia was saying, his voice carrying across the bullpen. 20 years I've been keeping these streets safe. 20 years. And this guy shows up and starts throwing around words like excessive force and racial bias? Reynolds set down his pen and walked closer, curious about what had triggered Garcia's outburst. "What happened?" he asked Officer Tom Phillips, who was standing at the edge of the group. "Wilson put Garcia on administrative leave pending an investigation," Phillips explained quietly. "Something about roughing up a teenager during a drug bust last month." Garcia had spotted Reynolds now. "Hey Reynolds, you've dealt with Wilson, right? What's his deal? Is he one of those types who thinks every white cop is out to get black suspects?" Reynolds felt uncomfortable as several pairs of eyes turned toward him. "I've only spoken to him once," he said carefully. "He seemed professional." Garcia snorted. "Professional, my ass. He's got an agenda. You mark my words, he's going to tear this department apart with his witch hunt." "Maybe you should cool down," Reynolds suggested. "Getting worked up isn't going to help your case." "My case?" Garcia stepped closer, his breath smelling of the whiskey he probably shouldn't have been drinking on duty. "I don't have a case to make. I did my job. That kid was reaching for something in his waistband. What was I supposed to do? Wait to see. If it was a gun?" "Was it a gun?" Reynolds asked before he could stop himself. A dangerous silence fell over the group. Garcia's eyes narrowed. "It could have been," he said finally. "Turned out to be a phone. But in that neighborhood, at that time of night, I made a split-second decision to protect myself." Reynolds nodded slowly. He understood the reality of split-second decisions. Every cop did, but he also knew that some officers seemed to make those decisions differently depending on who they were dealing with. "Look," Reynolds said, trying to diffuse the tension, "administrative leave isn't the end of the world. If the facts are on your side, you'll be cleared." Garcia laughed bitterly. "Facts? You think Wilson cares about facts? He's already decided I'm guilty." He lowered his voice. "Between us, guys like him are the reason this job gets harder every day. They don't understand what it's like out there." Several officers nodded in agreement. Reynolds didn't. He'd seen the footage from a similar incident involving Garcia last year. The suspect hadn't been reaching for anything. He'd been following instructions to get his ID. Reynolds had said nothing then, telling himself it wasn't his business. Now he wondered if his silence had contributed to what happened with the teenager. "I've got paperwork to finish," Reynolds said, turning away from the group. As he walked back to his desk, he could feel Garcia's eyes boring into his back. The next morning, Reynolds arrived at the daily grind earlier than usual. He'd been thinking about Garcia's outburst all night, and about Wilson's efforts to address problematic behavior in the department. Reynolds had always considered himself one of the good cops, but he was beginning to question whether staying silent when he saw problems was really good enough. He was surprised to find Wilson already there, sitting at what Reynolds now thought of as his table by the window. The IA director was alone, reading the newspaper. Without giving himself time to reconsider, Reynolds ordered his coffee and then approached Wilson's table. "Director Wilson," he said, "mind if I join you?" Wilson looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he gestured to the empty chair. "Not at all, Detective Reynolds." Reynolds sat down, suddenly unsure what he wanted to say. He took a sip of his coffee to buy time. "I heard about Officer Garcia," he said finally. Wilson's expression remained neutral. "I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing investigations." "I understand," Reynolds said quickly. "I'm not asking for details, I just—" He trailed off, then started again. "I wanted to say that I think what you're doing is important." Now Wilson looked genuinely surprised. "Thank you," he said cautiously. "Not everyone in the department shares that view." Reynolds smiled wryly. "Yeah, I gathered that from Garcia's little speech yesterday." "Change isn't easy," Wilson said, folding his newspaper and setting it aside, "especially when it challenges how things have always been done." "Some things should change," Reynolds said quietly. He hesitated, then added, "I've seen Garcia cross lines before. I never said anything." Wilson studied him for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I'm saying something," Reynolds replied. "If you need a statement about what I've witnessed, I'll provide one." Wilson nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Detective. It takes courage to speak up, especially against a fellow officer." The bell above the door jingled, and Reynolds glanced over to see Officer Garcia entering the coffee shop. Garcia spotted them immediately, his face darkening with anger. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he said loudly, striding toward their table. "Having a nice chat about me, are you?" "Officer Garcia," Wilson said calmly. "This isn't the place for this conversation." Garcia ignored him, focusing on Reynolds instead. "So you're buddying up to the rat catcher now, Reynolds? Throwing your brothers in blue under the bus to score points with the new boss?" Reynolds stood slowly. "You're making a scene, Miguel. Go home. Sleep it off. Don't tell me what to do," Garcia snarled, stepping closer. His eyes were bloodshot, and Reynolds could smell alcohol on his breath again. "You think you're better than me? You think you've never crossed a line?" "We've all made mistakes," Reynolds said evenly. "The difference is whether we learn from them." Garcia laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Listen to you, so righteous now. Where was all this righteousness when we were partners 3 years ago? You didn't have a problem with my methods then." Reynolds felt Wilson's eyes on him, but kept his focus on Garcia. "You're right, I should have spoken up sooner, that's on me." "Damn right it's on you," Garcia said, jabbing a finger into Reynolds' chest. "You're a hypocrite, Frank." Other customers were watching now, some looking concerned, others recording with their phones. Reynolds noticed the barista reaching for the phone behind the counter, probably to call the police, which would be ironic given that 3 police officers were already present. "This conversation is over," Wilson said, standing. "Officer Garcia, you're currently on administrative leave. I suggest you go home before you make your situation worse." Garcia's head swiveled toward Wilson, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You don't give me orders," he hissed. "You think because you've got that fancy title you can tell me what to do? You people always think you're in charge now." The racial undertone in Garcia's words was unmistakable. Reynolds saw Wilson stiffen slightly but maintain his composure. "Miguel," Reynolds said firmly, "that's enough." Garcia's hand moved to his hip, where his service weapon would normally be holstered. Even though he was off duty and likely unarmed, The gesture sent a chill through Reynolds. The situation was escalating beyond what he'd anticipated, and he had a sinking feeling that what happened next would change all their lives forever. Time seemed to slow down in the coffee shop as Officer Garcia's hand hovered near his hip. The morning chatter had died completely, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the hissing of the espresso machine. Reynolds assessed the situation quickly, noting the civilians around them, the position of tables that could provide cover, and the distance to the exit. "Miguel," Reynolds said again, keeping his voice steady and low. "Let's take this outside." Garcia's eyes never left Wilson's face. "You don't get it, do you, Reynolds? Men like him are trying to destroy everything we've built. They come in with their fancy degrees and their talk about reform and accountability. What they really want is to tear down the system." Wilson remained remarkably calm. "Officer Garcia, I understand you're upset, but this isn't about destroying anything. It's about making sure the department serves everyone equally." "Equally?" Garcia spat the word like it tasted bitter. "You mean giving special treatment to certain neighborhoods while leaving others to fend for themselves? You mean second-guessing every decision officers make in the field? I mean ensuring that the color of someone's skin doesn't determine how they're treated by those sworn to protect them," Wilson replied, his voice still measured but with an edge of steel now. "I mean holding officers accountable when they cross the line." Garcia took a step closer to Wilson. Reynolds subtly shifted his position, ready to intervene if necessary. "You have no idea what it's like out there," Garcia said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You sit in your nice office looking at reports and videos, making judgments about split-second decisions. Have you ever had someone pull a gun on you? Have you ever had to decide in an instant whether to shoot or be shot?" "I spent 7 years as a beat cop in Detroit before going to law school," Wilson said quietly. "So yes, I know exactly what it's like." This seemed to throw Garcia momentarily. He hadn't expected Wilson to have street experience. His eyes narrowed as he searched for a new angle of attack. "Detroit," he scoffed. "That explains a lot. Bringing your big city ideas to our department. We do things differently here." "That's the problem," Wilson said. "Some things shouldn't be done differently depending on where you are. The law is the law." Reynolds noticed Garcia's right hand twitching. The man was spiraling, his anger feeding on itself. Reynolds had seen this before in suspects, the moment when reason gave way to rage. He needed to defuse the situation now. "Miguel," Reynolds said, stepping between Garcia and Wilson, "you need to walk away, right now, before you do something you can't take back." Garcia's eyes snapped to Reynolds, burning with betrayal. "You're choosing him over me? Over your own?" "This isn't about choosing sides," Reynolds said. "This is about doing what's right." "What's right?" Garcia laughed, a harsh bark that made several customers flinch. "You want to talk about what's right? What's right is standing by your fellow officers. What's right is respecting the badge. The badge means nothing if we don't uphold what it stands for," Reynolds countered. Garcia's face contorted with rage. In one fluid motion, he reached behind his back and pulled out a small pistol, his backup weapon. Several people screamed. Reynolds instinctively reached for his own gun, but he'd left it locked in his car. "Put the gun down, Miguel," Reynolds said, his hands raised slightly in a calming gesture. "This isn't worth throwing away your career, your life." But Garcia wasn't pointing the gun at Reynolds. He had it aimed directly at Wilson, who stood absolutely still, his eyes fixed on Garcia's. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy my life?" Garcia growled. 20 years on the force, 20 years, and you want to take it all away because some punk kid made the wrong move at the wrong time?" Wilson spoke with remarkable steadiness for a man with a gun pointed at him. "I'm not destroying your life, Officer Garcia. Your actions are, put the gun down and we can talk about this like professionals." "Professionals?" Garcia's hand trembled slightly, making the gun waver. "There's nothing professional about a witch hunt. You had it in for me from day one." Reynolds watched Garcia's finger tighten on the trigger. He knew he had only seconds to act. Without fully thinking it through, he lunged forward, grabbing Garcia's wrist and forcing the gun upward just as it went off. The shot hit the ceiling, sending down a shower of plaster dust and triggering more screams from the patrons. They struggled for control of the weapon. Garcia might have been older, but he was still strong, fueled by rage and alcohol. He slammed, his free hand into Reynolds' ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Reynolds managed to keep his grip on Garcia's wrist, twisting it painfully to try to force him to drop the gun. "Let go," Garcia shouted. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," Reynolds gasped, still struggling to breathe. He caught a glimpse of Wilson moving to the side, keeping clear of their struggle but not running away. The bell above the door jingled as two uniformed officers burst in, weapons drawn. They had clearly been nearby and responded to calls about the disturbance. "Police, drop the weapon," one shouted. Garcia's eyes darted to the newcomers, momentary confusion crossing his face as he saw fellow officers pointing guns at him. Reynolds used the distraction to deliver a sharp blow to Garcia's wrist, finally forcing him to drop the pistol. It clattered to the floor and Reynolds kicked it away. The officers rushed forward, one securing the weapon while the other pulled Garcia's arms behind his back and cuffed him. Garcia didn't resist, the fight seeming to drain out of him as the reality of what he'd done sank in. "You're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon," the officer said, reciting the Miranda rights as he secured the cuffs. Garcia looked up at Reynolds, his eyes no longer burning with rage but hollow with realization. "You don't understand what you've done," he said quietly. "This is bigger than one incident. They're coming for all of us, Frank. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be you." Reynolds shook his head. "No, Miguel. They're not coming for good cops. They're coming for those who abuse their power. There's a difference." As the officers led Garcia toward the door, he turned his head to look back at Wilson. "This isn't over," he called out. "You'll see. The department won't stand for this." Wilson watched him go, his composure finally showing cracks as he ran a hand over his face. Reynolds noticed the slight tremor in that hand, the only outward sign that Wilson had been afraid. "Are you all right?" Reynolds asked him. Wilson nodded, slowly. "Yes. Thanks to you." He looked around at the chaos of the coffee shop, overturned chairs, spilled drinks, frightened customers being interviewed by the responding officers. Though I think the daily grind might ban police officers after this, the attempt at humor surprised Reynolds. He found himself chuckling despite the throbbing pain in his ribs. "Probably. There's always the place on 5th Street, though their coffee isn't as good." A female officer approached them, notebook in hand. "Detective Reynolds? Director Wilson? We need your statements." Wilson nodded. "Of course, officer." As they gave their accounts of what happened, Reynolds noticed how methodical Wilson was, sticking to facts without embellishment. No dramatic language, no attempts to paint Garcia as worse than he was. Just the truth. An officer who had crossed a line, threatened a superior, and pulled a weapon in a public place. When they finished, the officer closed her notebook. "We'll need you both to come to the station to make formal statements." "We'll be right behind you," Wilson assured her. When they were alone again, Wilson turned to Reynolds. "You could have been killed." Reynolds shrugged, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Just doing my job." "No," Wilson said firmly. "Your job wasn't to put yourself between a gun and me. That was beyond duty." He paused, studying Reynolds carefully. "Why did you do it?" Reynolds considered the question. Why had he risked his life for a man he barely knew? Was it just instinct, professional obligation, or something more? "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because we need people like you in the department. People who aren't afraid to hold the line on what's right even when it's hard." Wilson extended his hand. "Thank you, Detective Reynolds." Reynolds shook it, feeling the strength in Wilson's grip. "Frank," he said. "Call me Frank." As they walked out of the coffee shop toward their respective cars, Reynolds knew that what had happened today would ripple through the department like a stone thrown into still water. Garcia wasn't wrong about one thing. This was bigger than a single incident. It was about what kind of police force they wanted to be, what standards they would uphold, and who they would protect. The gun had been pointed at Wilson, but the real target was the change he represented. Reynolds had made his choice clear today. He just hoped enough of his fellow officers would make the same one. The police station buzzed with unusual energy as Reynolds pushed through the heavy glass doors. News traveled fast in the department, and by the time he arrived to give his formal statement, everyone seemed to know what had happened at the daily grind. Officers gathered in small clusters, conversations dropping to whispers as he passed. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others averted their eyes. Reynolds made his way to the interview room where a detective from Internal Affairs waited to take his statement. Not Wilson. The director had rightly recused himself from the investigation, given his direct involvement in the incident. The detective, a woman named Linda Chen who had transferred from Robbery Division to IA last year, greeted him with professional courtesy. "Detective Reynolds, thank you for coming in promptly." Reynolds took a seat across from her. "No problem, let's get this done." For the next hour, he recounted the morning's events in painstaking detail, from his conversation with Wilson to Garcia's arrival, the escalating tension, and finally the moment when Garcia pulled the gun. Chen recorded the interview and took notes, asking clarifying questions but otherwise letting Reynolds tell the story at his own pace. And after the gun discharged, Chen asked, "What was Officer Garcia's demeanor?" Reynolds considered the question. Confused at first, when the uniformed officers came in, he seemed almost shocked to see them pointing weapons at him, like he couldn't believe it had gone that far. Chen nodded, making another note. "In your opinion, was he intending to shoot Director Wilson?" "I don't know," Reynolds said honestly. "Garcia was drunk and angry. His finger was on the trigger. Whether he would have actually pulled it..." He shook his head. "I wasn't willing to wait and find out." When the interview concluded, Chen thanked him again. "The chief wants to see you before you leave," she added. "His office." Reynolds felt a flicker of apprehension. Chief Robert Patterson had been with the department for 30 years, rising through the ranks the old-fashioned way. He was fair but traditional, sometimes resistant to change. Reynolds wasn't sure how the chief would view today's events, as a justified arrest of an officer gone rogue, or as an embarrassing internal conflict that should have been handled differently. He knocked on the chief's door and waited. "Come in," Patterson called. Reynolds entered to find not only the chief but also Wilson seated across from the large oak desk. Wilson gave him a slight nod. "Sit down, Frank," the chief said, gesturing to an empty chair. His expression gave nothing away. "I've been hearing about your morning." Reynolds took the seat next to Wilson. "Yes, sir." "Director Wilson was just telling me his version of events," Patterson continued. "Says you probably saved his life." "I just reacted, sir," Reynolds said. "Any officer would have done the same." Wilson cleared his throat. "With respect, I'm not sure that's true. Several people in that coffee shop froze. Frank didn't." The chief studied Reynolds for a long moment. "You've been with us, 15 years now?" 17 next month, sir." Patterson nodded slowly. "Never any major complaints. Solid closure rate. Keep your head down and do the work." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "So, I'm curious, why step into this particular situation? Garcia was well liked by many in the department. You had to know taking his side would put you in a difficult position." "I didn't take his side, sir," Reynolds corrected. "I took the side of doing what's right. Garcia pulled a gun on a fellow officer in a public place. There's no justification for that, no matter what grievance he thought he had." The chief glanced at Wilson, then back at Reynolds. "You know what I mean. There are those in the department who see Director Wilson's reform efforts as problematic. By intervening, you've effectively taken a stance in that debate." Reynolds felt a surge of frustration. "With all due respect, Chief, I don't see it that way. This isn't about taking sides in some departmental political debate. It's about basic right and wrong. An officer pulled a weapon on a superior in a crowded coffee shop. That's wrong, full stop. The room fell silent. Wilson kept his eyes on his folded hands. The chief sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Well, Patterson said finally, regardless of how you see it, others will have their opinions. You should be prepared for that. I can handle it, Reynolds said. The chief nodded. I believe you can. Which is why, effective immediately, I'm assigning you to work with Director Wilson's team on reviewing use of force incidents. Reynolds blinked in surprise. Sir, we need someone from homicide who understands the pressures officers face in high-risk situations, Patterson explained. Someone who can provide perspective while still maintaining objectivity. He glanced at Wilson. The director agrees you'd be a good fit. Wilson nodded. Your actions today demonstrated both courage and integrity, Frank. Those are exactly the qualities we need on this team. Reynolds felt conflicted. On one hand, the assignment was a vote of confidence from both the chief and Wilson. On the other hand, it would put him squarely in the crosshairs of officers who resented internal affairs oversight. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully, but I'm in the middle of the Westlake triple homicide investigation. Detective Moore can take lead on that, the chief said dismissively. This is more important right now. Garcia's actions have created a firestorm. We need to show both the department and the public that we're serious about accountability. Reynolds understood what was happening. The chief was using him, his reputation as a solid, by-the-book detective, to lend credibility to Wilson's reform efforts while also creating distance between the administration and the changes being implemented. It was clever politics. How long would this assignment last, Reynolds asked. Initially 6 months, Wilson said. With the possibility of extension if it's working well, the chief stood, signaling the conversation was nearing its end. Take the day to think it over. Let me know your decision in the morning. Reynolds nodded and stood as well. Yes, sir. Outside the chief's office, Wilson caught up with him in the hallway. For what it's worth, he said quietly, this wasn't my idea, but I do think you'd be an asset to the team. Reynolds studied Wilson's face, looking for signs of political calculation, but finding only sincerity. The other officers won't see it that way, he said. They'll call me a traitor. A rat. Probably, Wilson agreed. Is that enough reason to turn down the assignment? Reynolds didn't have an immediate answer. He'd spent his career trying to be a good cop without making waves. Now he was being asked to help enforce standards that many of his colleagues resisted. It would mean sacrificing relationships, some of them decades old. I need that day to think about it, he said finally. Wilson nodded. I understand. But for what it's worth, the department needs people like you right now. People who recognize that respecting the badge means holding it to the highest standard, not protecting those who dishonor it. As Wilson walked away, Reynolds felt the weight of the decision before him. It wasn't just about a temporary assignment. It was about what kind of officer, what kind of person he wanted to be. The news vans were already parked outside Reynolds' apartment building when he arrived home that evening. The coffee shop incident had made the local news, complete with cell phone footage of Garcia being led away in handcuffs. A reporter spotted Reynolds and rushed toward him, microphone extended. Detective Reynolds, can you comment on Officer Garcia's arrest? Is it true he pulled a gun on the head of Internal Affairs? Reynolds pushed past without answering, using his key fob to access the private entrance. Inside, he leaned against the wall of the elevator, suddenly exhausted. His phone had been buzzing all afternoon with messages from fellow officers, some supportive, others accusatory. He hadn't answered any of them. In his apartment, Reynolds poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat in the darkness by the window, looking out at the city lights. His mind kept returning to Garcia's words. They're coming for all of us, Frank. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be you. The irony wasn't lost on him. By stepping in to stop Garcia, he had indeed put himself in the crosshairs, not of Internal Affairs, but of officers who believed the thin blue line meant protecting their own, right or wrong. His phone lit up with an incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. Reynolds hesitated, then answered. Reynolds. Detective, this is Pete Morgan, from the police union. The union rep's voice was carefully neutral. I wanted to touch base about today's incident. Officer Garcia has requested union representation for his disciplinary hearing. Given your involvement, we'd appreciate it if you'd coordinate your statement with our defense strategy. Reynolds felt a chill. Are you asking me to change my account of what happened? Not change, Morgan said quickly. Just emphasize certain aspects. Garcia's exemplary record, the stress he was under due to the IA investigation, the fact that no one was actually harmed. He pointed a gun at the director of internal affairs in a crowded coffee shop, Reynolds said flatly. He fired a shot into the ceiling. Those are facts I can't de-emphasize. Morgan's tone cooled. I see. Well, I hope you'll reconsider. The union stands behind its members, Detective. All its members. Remember that when you decide whose side you're on. The call ended, leaving Reynolds with a bitter taste in his mouth that had nothing to do with the whiskey. The lines were being drawn, and he was being forced to choose a side. The problem was, he wasn't sure there were only two sides in this fight. Maybe there was a third way, one that upheld the law while acknowledging the challenges officers faced. Reynolds took another sip of whiskey and thought about Wilson's offer. Maybe this was exactly where he needed to be right now. In the uncomfortable middle, trying to build a bridge between those who resisted change at all costs and those who demanded it immediately. It wouldn't be easy. It might even be impossible. But someone had to try. Reynolds arrived at the station early the next morning, his decision made. He'd spent most of the night weighing his options, thinking about his career, his colleagues, and what he truly believed was right. The quiet of pre-dawn found him at peace with his choice, though he harbored no illusions about the difficult road ahead. Chief Patterson was already in his office, a cup of coffee steaming on his desk as he reviewed paperwork. He looked up when Reynolds knocked on the open door. Come in, Frank, he said, setting down his pen. I take it you've made your decision? Reynolds nodded, taking a seat across from the chief. I'll join Director Wilson's team. Patterson studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. I thought you might. You've always had a strong sense of right and wrong. It's what makes you a good detective. He leaned back in his chair. It's also what's going to make this assignment particularly challenging for you. I understand that, sir. Do you? The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. The department is divided, Frank. More than I've ever seen it. Half the officers think Garcia got what he deserved. The other half think he's being sacrificed on the altar of political correctness. You're stepping into the middle of that divide. Reynolds met the chief's gaze steadily. Someone has to. A hint of a smile touched Patterson's lips. That's what I was hoping you'd say. He reached for a folder on his desk and handed it to Reynolds. Garcia's disciplinary hearing is scheduled for next week. The DA is also considering criminal charges. The union is fighting both, of course. Reynolds took the folder. And my role in all this? For now, you'll work with Wilson on reviewing similar incidents, cases where officers might have crossed the line. The goal is to establish clearer guidelines for use of force and to identify patterns that need addressing. The chief leaned forward. But let me be clear. This isn't about punishing officers. It's about making the department better. I understand, sir. Patterson nodded. Wilson's waiting for you in room 305. And Frank, watch your back. Not everyone will appreciate what you're doing. Room 305 turned out to be a small, windowless space that had been converted into a temporary office. Boxes of files lined one wall, and a whiteboard covered another, filled with notes in Wilson's neat handwriting. The man himself sat at a desk reviewing documents, looking up when Reynolds entered. You decided to join us, Wilson said, a statement rather than a question. I did, Reynolds confirmed. Wilson gestured to an empty desk against the opposite wall. That's yours. I've pulled 20 cases to start with. Use of force complaints from the past year that were dismissed without thorough investigation. He studied Reynolds for a moment. How are you holding up? I imagine yesterday was difficult. Reynolds shrugged. I've had better days. Got some interesting calls last night. Threatening? Not explicitly, just reminders of where my loyalties should lie. Wilson nodded grimly. That will likely continue. The blue wall of silence is real, and you're now seen as a potential breach. Reynolds set his coffee on the empty desk and began unpacking his laptop. I've been thinking about that. The thin blue line and all it represents. He paused, organizing his thoughts. When I joined the force, I was told it meant that police stand between order and chaos, between the law-abiding and the lawless. But, Wilson prompted. But over time, for some officers, it's become something else. A line that divides police from everyone else. A justification for closing ranks, even when one of our own does something wrong. Reynolds shook his head. That's not what I signed up for. Wilson watched him thoughtfully. Not everyone will see it that way. I know. But maybe some will. Maybe enough to make a difference. They worked in companionable silence for the next few hours, Reynolds reviewing case files, making notes about patterns he observed. Most of the complaints had been dismissed with minimal investigation, often based solely on the officer's account of events, even when witness statements contradicted it. Around noon, a knock at the door interrupted their work. Officer Tom Phillips stood in the doorway, his expression uncomfortable. Got a minute, Frank? Reynolds glanced at Wilson, who nodded. Take your time. Reynolds followed Phillips to the break room, which emptied quickly as they entered. Whether to give them privacy or to avoid being seen with Reynolds, he wasn't sure. What's up, Tom? Reynolds asked, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. Phillips shifted his weight, clearly uneasy. Words going around about your new assignment. News travels fast. People are talking, Frank, saying you've turned your back on your fellow officers, that you're helping Wilson witch hunt good cops. Reynolds took a slow sip of his coffee. Is that what you think? Phillips hesitated. I don't know what to think. Garcia crossed a line, no question. But going after other officers for minor stuff from the past? That feels wrong. What if it's not minor? Reynolds asked quietly. What if there's a pattern of behavior that needs addressing? Don't the people we serve deserve that? We put our lives on the line every day. Phillips countered. Split-second decisions. Monday morning quarterbacking is easy when you weren't there. Reynolds nodded. You're right. The job is hard, and most officers do it well. But when someone abuses their power, when they let bias affect their judgment, we can't just look the other way. That undermines everything the badge stands for. Phillips studied him for a long moment. A lot of officers won't want to work with you after this. I know, Reynolds said simply. I can live with that. As Phillips turned to leave, he paused. For what it's worth, I think you're wrong about this, but I respect you for standing by what you believe. It wasn't exactly support, but it was something. Reynolds returned to room 305 with a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but perhaps not impossible. 6 months passed quickly. The work was challenging but rewarding. Reynolds and Wilson's team identified several officers with concerning patterns of behavior and developed intervention strategies, additional training, counseling, reassignment to different beats. Some officers resisted, others grudgingly accepted the help. A few even thanked them later. Garcia's case concluded with his dismissal from the force and a suspended sentence for reckless endangerment. The former officer left town shortly after, moving to a small city in a neighboring state. Reynolds heard rumors that he was working security at a shopping mall. On a crisp fall morning, Reynolds arrived at the daily grind for the first time since the incident. He'd avoided it these past months, getting his coffee elsewhere, but today felt different. It was time to reclaim this small part of his routine. The cafe had changed owners. New art hung on the walls and the furniture had been rearranged. But the coffee smelled the same, rich and inviting. Reynolds ordered as usual and found a seat by the window, the same table where it had all begun. He was halfway through his coffee when Wilson walked in, spotted him, and came over. Mind if I join you? Wilson asked. Reynolds gestured to the empty chair. Not at all. Wilson ordered his coffee and returned to the table. I didn't know you still came here. First time back, actually, Reynolds admitted. Seemed appropriate somehow. Full circle. Wilson nodded in understanding. The department announced the new use of force policies yesterday. Your input was invaluable in shaping them. Any pushback? Some, Wilson acknowledged. But less than expected. The younger officers especially seem to get it. They want to be part of a department they can be proud of. Reynolds smiled slightly. That's progress. It is, Wilson agreed. And speaking of progress, I have news. The chief is creating a permanent reform and accountability unit. He wants you to head it up. Reynolds nearly choked on his coffee. Me? I'm just a detective. Not anymore. The promotion to lieutenant comes with the position. Wilson smiled at Reynolds' stunned expression. You've earned it, Frank. You've shown courage few others would have. Reynolds looked around the coffee shop, thinking about how much had changed in 6 months. He'd lost friends, yes, but he'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he'd stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. And maybe, just maybe, he'd helped move the department a little closer to what it should be. I'd be honored, he said finally. As they sat there talking about the future of the department, Reynolds felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in years. Change was slow, often painfully so. There would be setbacks and resistance. But with each small step forward, each officer who chose integrity over blind loyalty, each policy reformed to ensure equal treatment for all, they were building something better. The incident that had started it all, a racist cop pointing a gun at the director of internal affairs over a seat dispute, had been terrible. But from that terrible moment had come a chance for real change. Reynolds thought about the words on his badge. To protect and serve. For too long, some had forgotten the second part, or believed it only applied to certain people. That was changing now, slowly but surely. Outside the coffee shop window, the city went about its business. People of all backgrounds living their lives, trusting that those sworn to protect them would do so fairly and justly. Reynolds watched them pass and renewed his silent promise to be worthy of that trust every single day.